Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's YAPF Skills for Success event. My name is Andy Thompson. I'm an architect at Warner Brown's Architects and the chair of the YAPF. Skills for Success is now into its third year and it is an annual series of events based around a common theme. This year's theme has changed, and I'll leave it up to Andrea to introduce tonight's speaker shortly. I did just want to shortly preview the other events that are in the series. So in 2 weeks' time, we're having a workshop with Mortal Fools, who are a theatre company who are going to deliver a workshop about leadership with us. On the 12th of November, we welcome Geraldine Denning from Architects for Social Housing to talk about innovative solutions to the housing crisis in London and how knocking down social housing estates isn't always the best way forward. And on the 26th of November, we welcome a series of small practice owners who set up in the face of adversity as young architects. We're delighted to welcome Chris Loyne, Emily Scullion, Anna Parker and Matt Bell from various practices across the region. I'm going to now hand over to Andrea to introduce this evening's speaker. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Andrea Antone. I'm a member of the YAPF committee and senior architect for Ride Architecture. I will be introducing Ben Channon for you tonight. Ben is an architect, author, TED speaker and mental well-being advocate. He's head of the well-being at Arsenal Architecture, where he heads up the practices research into this area and advises all teams on how to design healthier buildings. In 2017, he co-founded the Architects Mental Wellbeing Forum in response to the mental health crisis in architecture, further being shortlisted for the RIBA Rising Star 2018 award. Today, his credentials also include a role on the Well Mind Advisor, which aims to help raise the bar for healthy, high-performing buildings and communities around the world. Thank you, Ben, for joining us, and we'll head over to you.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Can people hear me? Yeah, great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for introducing me.
You need to share your screen, Ben. Then
I need to. Yeah, I will share my screen now. Great. So hopefully you guys can see this presentation full screen now. Okay. I can't hear anybody else, so I'll take that as a yes. There we go. Great. So yeah, I just want to say firstly, thank you so much to Andrea and everybody there at YAPF for having me. It's really nice to be part of this series and hopefully to share with you guys some of the things that I've learned over my, as you'll see, quite rocky journey through architecture. So yeah, as Andrea said, my name's Ben Channon. I'm the head of wellbeing here at Arsenal Architecture. I'm also a mental health first aider. I co-founded the Architects Mental Wellbeing Forum a couple of years ago, and I wrote a book as well called Happy by Design, which I'm going to talk about briefly later too. But really for this session, with the theme of this series being change, I wanted to kind of look at how we can cultivate kind of a strong, resilient mindset and look at that idea of mindset change. I think it's something that's really important within architecture, probably now more than ever. And I also wanted to just delve into how we can kind of use difficult situations as actually a bit of a springboard for some positive change, kind of whether that's within ourselves or within the wider industry. So, I mean, that's been a bit of a theme, certainly on my journey, and I really wanted to talk today kind of less about necessarily broader principles or the concepts of mental health and things, because I'm sure you guys know a lot about that already. I just wanted to really be a bit more personal today and share some of my story. So I know it's a little bit cheesy, but I chose this image to kind of sum up my story because the surfing metaphor seemed quite apt, really. With surfing, you get better by failing, essentially, by making mistakes, by trying to get up, getting knocked off again and again. And the most important part of learning to surf is about getting back on the board and learning from what went wrong before and trying to analyze where you can improve. And certainly within my journey so far, there's been waves, there's been peaks and troughs, and we work in an industry which does suffer from peaks and troughs, as we're all experiencing right now. We're certainly in a trough at the moment, and My heart goes out to any of you out there who are struggling with work, struggling with redundancies. I know there's a lot of it going on, but hopefully there will be some lessons and things you might be able to take away from this evening that can support you through what is undoubtedly going to be a tricky few months. But ultimately, it is an industry where there's a real lack of certainty. You know, you look at other industries, say if you're a divorce lawyer, people are always getting divorced, and sad as that is, you're always in a job. Whereas the property industry, architecture, it really is a case of boom and bust. And so what's really important for us is that we develop that resilience. So in terms of my story, I wanted to really go right back to the start, where for a lot of people, I think you should think about your journey in architecture starting at architecture school, but actually I think it's important that we go back a little bit further and look at kind of the education system that we all come through nowadays. You know, it's very focused on exams, on these traditional ideas of success, you know, that being clever, doing well at exams, that makes you successful. And that kind of builds up this mentality where we're constantly comparing ourselves to other people in terms of our achievements. We're constantly, you know, we're obsessed with basically perfectionism and being the top of the class or the best in the year. And I definitely, looking back at my story, completely fell into that mold. I got really caught up in that mindset at school, you know, striving to always be the top of the class and be the best at everything. And of course, you can't always succeed. But I did okay at school. I found I was naturally quite good at exams, which made things easier for me. But then you kind of move on to university, and I'm sure many of you will have experienced this. You get good grades at secondary school, you go on to university, and then you suddenly realise, oh shit, everyone here is really talented. You know, everyone got A's and B's at A levels. They're all a really clever bunch. I was at Cardiff, which at the time it still is, but it was a very high performing university, and I got there, and yeah, I was surrounded by loads of really clever people, and I suddenly realised to be top of the year here was going to be very different to being top of the year at secondary school. And there's that kind of instant conflict because you've got 100 amazing, talented students who are all trying to be in the top 10%, and mathematically that just can't work. You know, 50%, just statistically, 50% of people have to score below the average mark. So there is this strange conflict, which I believe is partly to blame for the kind of studio culture that we see now, where architecture school is very competitive. Everyone is really pushing themselves. You'll have all been through it. Everyone's pushing themselves all hours of the day and night to produce the most work, to produce the best visualizations, the most daring project. And you know, it's not helped by the fact that we have these kind of side-by-side crits where your work is literally displayed next to the kind of the other students, and it creates this atmosphere that rather than trying to learn from each other, you're actually competing with each other. You know, there's this idea that there's a certain amount of firsts out there, and we're all fighting each other for those firsts, which I don't know if that's a particularly healthy model. I mean, to an extent, it works quite well for a lot of the tutors because it means they get a lot of work out of their students. It means, you know, students really often push themselves into complete mental health crisis, and you only need to look at some of the stats that I'll come to talk about later to realise that absolutely is happening within universities. And I'm not blaming architecture schools necessarily. I'm certainly not blaming the tutors, heads of year, because I speak to tutors and heads of years a lot, and I know that, you know, the vast majority of them have students' best interests at heart. They want their students to be happy, to be healthy. But it's this system that we are stuck in, and my belief is that it's not necessarily conducive to great mental health. So I would say in my case, sadly, that probably did happen. I did develop some of those tendencies, perfectionism, trying to outwork people, and sadly I carried that over into my professional life, really. So I finished my part 2 at Cardiff, and I did well, but you know, put myself through a lot to get the grades I got. But I joined a sale back in 2012 and started doing my part 3, and I definitely think I just retained that mindset that I'd got from GCSE, or probably even earlier, probably earlier than GCSEs, and then through GCSEs, A levels, and university, of just trying to be the best, having to shine and impress people. And because of that mindset, I got to a sale and I was like, right, I've really got to impress the senior management here. And I just started working longer and longer hours of my own volition, not kind of encouraged by any of the senior management here. But I really pushed myself to work more and more. And I really just piled pressure on myself until really it became unsustainable. So at first I started noticing kind of physical health problems. My immune system basically was just running on empty. So I had like constant headaches, coughs, and then I got shingles, which I don't know if any of you have ever had shingles. It's really pretty unpleasant. It's basically like when chickenpox comes back as an adult and it really wipes you out. And then I gave myself this case of sort of tonsillitis, but it was like tonsillitis on steroids, where they just couldn't get rid of it with any drugs they gave me. So I was on antibiotics for 6 months, and eventually I had to take my tonsils out. And I was just thinking, God, I'm really unlucky. All these physical things going wrong with me. But luckily, I went to see a GP about these problems, and eventually she was like, "You've had a lot going on here. Can I ask you a few questions about your mental health?" And luckily, she was very perceptive GP, and she realised that there was something deeper going on there, because I don't know if I would have ever really realised. But basically, I just burnt myself out, and my anxiety levels were through the roof. Kind of a bit of depression thrown in there as well for good measure. Basically, I just wasn't in a good place, but I had been completely unaware of that. Partly because I'd never been taught about mental health as well. But luckily I was referred to the NHS for some CBT therapy, which was really helpful, and kind of helped me to get a better understanding of what was going on in my head, why I developed this mindset, why I was getting very stressed over quite minor things, and actually really helped me to step back and reevaluate my working patterns. I also signed up for a year-long course with the Mindfulness Foundation, which was really interesting. And again, that was very helpful in terms of helping me get a better handle on my emotions and a better understanding of why I felt certain things, why I reacted in certain ways, and actually, rather than seeing my emotions as a part of me, seeing my emotions, observing my emotions happening, but just almost from a little bit of a distance, and being able to step back from that. And I found that very, very helpful as well. But the most important upshot of everything was that it really made me pause and look at my relationship with work. I realized that I had cultivated a pretty unhealthy way of working, kind of focused on how much time I was putting in rather than actually on the output. And I think that's a theme across architecture. There's definitely an attitude in a lot of people I speak to within their practices. They'll say it's a kind of bums on seats attitude, where directors are almost more bothered about how much time you spend at your desk, and they see that as a mark of productive people. In my head, we've got it the wrong way round, actually. And if you have to spend long hours at your desk to get your work done, actually maybe you need to reassess the way you're working. If what we should really be prioritizing is celebrating efficient people who can work effectively, get their work done by 5:30, 6 p.m. and go home. Instead, as an industry, we tend to champion these people that are there till midnight, and this kind of the deadline day hero, the all-nighter syndrome. It's not healthy, and we need to reassess that as an industry. But that experience also made me realize that I had a quite new kind of strong passion for this thing called mental health that no one had ever really taught me about when I was a kid. And to be honest, it wasn't something that 8 years ago people were really discussing all that much. But I discovered I could kind of harness this interest and this passion and connect it back to what I was doing. I was designing homes for people every single day, and I wasn't necessarily thinking that much about the kind of impact of my designs on their mental health and their happiness. So funnily enough, I kind of look back at that experience now as quite a positive thing, and obviously this session's about my mindset shift, and that negative experience really was a catalyst to help me move forward in a positive way. And I know it's a very difficult thing to say to anybody who's going through personal problems, going through problems with work, and at the time, often it seems like this is the worst thing that's ever happened to anyone. It certainly felt like that with me. But actually, my kind of solace to you, my message to you, if you are in that position right now, would be that you may actually look back in years to come, and it may not seem like it now, but you may look back and say, actually, that's something that was a lesson rather than it's something I learned from, rather than something that kind of ruined me. I think it's really important to keep that positive spin on things if we can. But that experience led me to start researching my book, Happy by Design, and I started bringing that research into my work at a sale and carved out the position that Andrew mentioned at the start, head of wellbeing, which is my role now. So I'm still involved with architectural projects, but rather than on the day-to-day running of projects, it's more about feeding into all of the different teams here and making sure that all of their projects actually have this strong focus on health and wellbeing, and we're designing them in a kind of ethical, sustainable and healthy way, which is a really nice part of the project to be involved on. It also inspired me to co-found the group I mentioned earlier, the Architects Mental Wellbeing Forum, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And yeah, ultimately it has led to a lot of opportunities in my life that I wouldn't have necessarily had if I hadn't been through that kind of crisis moment. Doing a TEDx talk, writing articles for journals and newspapers, and sort of becoming an ambassador for the Architects Benevolent Society. And it's strange that such a thing that seemed so negative at the time has gone on to open a lot of doors. So I'm kind of always a bit cautious about writing anything off as a failure. It's really important that we can try and reframe those things as lessons, much like surfing, you learn more from the waves that you fall off. So I also wanted to touch upon kind of our industry. I've obviously touched upon my story, my journey, but sadly, a lot of these things are pretty common across the industry. So if you look at the Architects Journal, for example, the student surveys, or I don't know if any of you have seen, it's a very good dissertation that we've shared actually on the Mental Wellbeing Forum's website, which it's by Melissa Kirkpatrick, and it's called Wellbeing and the Architecture Student. And in there, she basically explains that, there's a huge number of students requiring help with their mental health, both general students. So between 2006 and 2016, there was a 500% increase in mental health problems for students generally. And in the 2016 AJ Student Survey, a quarter of students said they were currently receiving support for their mental health, which is just an enormous figure. And a further quarter said that they were fearing they would need to get help soon. So that's over half of all respondents were basically in a bad place with their mental health, which to me is just shocking. And I think we need to look at why. I think it's really important we look at why. And obviously I've touched upon some of the reasons that I feel that happened to me, but I'm not a mental health expert. I've done the mental health first aid training, and it's an industry, it's an area I've been involved with and reading about and researching about for a very long time, but I'm not an expert. But I have spoken to, luckily, like the position I've got means I'm in contact with experts a lot, and I've spoken to people from a range of mental health backgrounds about this issue with architects, and a lot of them suspect it does relate to perfectionism. It relates to that long hours culture, and also that kind of work first attitude where work is the most important thing. Our work is more important than our happiness even, and our clients' happiness takes precedent over our happiness. And I'm sure many of you will have been in that position before, where you're so desperate to make your client happy or to make your director happy that you actually put your own happiness at the back of the queue. And when you think about that, it's so counterintuitive. If we're not happy in our work, we know that we're going to become less productive, and the quality of our work is going to drop off. So it's vitally important that we do look after ourselves as much as we look after our clients. I've also been talking to a group called Alternative Thinkers, who I don't know if you guys have heard of, but they're really interesting. And they ran an event a couple of weeks ago that I was involved with, where they stated that people working in creative roles are around 3 times more likely to develop a mental health problem. And I need to just follow up on that and find out where they got that stat from. But if that is true, that puts us people in creative industries at pretty significant risk of common mental health problems, things like anxiety and depression. So perhaps those stats that came up in Melissa's research weren't that surprising. And given that 1 in 4 people every year experience a common mental health problem like anxiety or depression, that obviously makes us very vulnerable. And I think that is a really interesting question to me. I'm not sure how much I buy into it, but this idea about whether creative personality types are kind of inherently more susceptible, that idea of kind of the Van Gogh image of the tortured artist. But maybe it's the other way around, actually. Maybe it's that we are just particularly passionate about our creations. And as I said, maybe we'll put the client's happiness first, but often maybe we'll put the project first too, but we'll become so obsessed with getting our project absolutely perfect that we'll put it ahead of our family or ahead of our sleep, or all of these things that are incredibly important to us, but get forgotten for the sake of our work. And there's a phrase that I quite like, which is, if you don't take time for your mental health, then you'll have to make time for your mental illness. So, and that's certainly what happened with me. I did not look after my mental health. I did not take care of myself, and it, in the short term, it really cost me. So we do need to just remember to stop and take time for those things that help us to relax and make us feel good. So I wanted to share with you guys briefly just some of the things that worked for me. So I've mentioned some of them already, that idea of being output focused rather than focusing on time. It's honestly something I'd recommend to everybody in every industry. It's about sitting down at the start of the day and being like, right, what is my output today? What do I need to produce? And you know what, if you've produced that by 5:15, don't feel guilty about leaving the office on time. I generally always try to leave in some wiggle room. I don't aim to finish stuff at 5:30, because I know that if I do, I'll probably end up running over and I'll finish at 6 or 6:30. I aim to finish stuff a bit early, and inevitably you end up, finishing stuff around 5:30, and that's perfect. That's where you want to be. But I would honestly say, don't be afraid to work your contracted hours. We all get those times where we have deadlines, and I do it. We have to pull extra hours to hit deadlines, but if that's every week, you need to really either have a look at the way you're working, or if you're genuinely under-resourced, which I know so many architects are, then you may need to have a difficult conversation with your associate director or your director about resourcing, and say, look, if I'm doing 60, 70 hours a week every week, it's not fair and it's not sustainable, and ultimately you will suffer and the project will suffer. There's this great book called The Happiness Advantage by Sean Aker, and he basically argues that we've kind of got things all wrong in society. We get taught that if you work really hard, you'll be successful, and then you'll get rich, and then you'll be happy. But actually, we need to flip it on its head and actually start with the happiness. The happiness isn't the end goal. The happiness should be where we want to start from. And if you're happy, you'll enjoy your work more. Your quality of your work will be better. Your clients will like you more. Ultimately, you'll be more successful and you'll make more money. And then it becomes a cyclical thing, rather than making yourself miserable for this never achievable goal of somehow idea of happiness. But yeah, I found that actually by going home, working 9 till 5:30, focusing on a better work-life balance, more sleep, and all of these things, it actually made me more productive. It made me better at solving problems, and it made me a more valuable member of staff. Another thing that I found really helpful is actually finding time to pause within the day too, especially if you start to feel overwhelmed. Actually, an old boss that I used to have said to me, he quite liked staff that went on smoking breaks. We had a few staff kicking off and going, it's not fair. He goes out for a cigarette every hour. And the boss said, well, actually, I find I have my best ideas when I stop for a coffee, or, he might have his best ideas when he stops for a cigarette. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think any of the greatest moments in architecture have happened when people have been sat there clicking away at Revit or Vectorworks. They've happened when you're pausing, when you're thinking, when you're considering things. And actually, for me as an architect, the best way we can add value is through ideas. It's not necessarily through kind of just being a CAD monkey. So I think those breaks are really important. They can help us to reset, and they can be when some of those magic moments of ideas happen too. And I also mentioned, for me, a big problem that I had was getting overwhelmed, those emotions overwhelming me. So learning to step away was one thing, but I also found, as I said, that meditation was incredibly helpful in that as well. Just helped me to get a better understanding and perspective on what emotions I was feeling. I could recognize them coming from a long way off, so that when actually emotions started to hit me, it was less of a kind of wave and more of a dribble, so much more manageable. I would also say, and this is definitely just from my experience, but discover what excites you and really pursue it kind of with all your energy. because if you're working on something that excites you or in an area that you're passionate about, it doesn't seem like hard work anymore. And that's certainly something that I kind of found by accident. I was lucky in that respect, but I would definitely say that when you're working on something you care about, it's much easier and it's much more enjoyable work. And similarly, if there's a role that you want, or that you think you want to work in a different way, you want to take on a different kind of work, then be proactive in developing and creating that role. I had to sit down with directors here at Sale and say, I've got as much well-being work now as I do project work, and I can either do one really well or I can do both kind of half-assed, and I would much rather do the well-being work really well. It can become a USP for the company, and it can enhance all of our projects, and thankfully they bought into that. But had I not been almost quite forceful with it and really pushed it, I would probably still be trying to juggle those, like spin those two plates, and probably, as I said, be doing a pretty average job on both of them. And similarly with promotions, I always say this to people as well. Push for a promotion. Ask if you think you deserve a promotion. Don't be nervous to bring it up in a review. I think a lot of people go into reviews and they kind of wait to get promoted. But from experience, if you shouldn't feel afraid to be proactive in that area. That's less of a tip for being happier and maybe more of a tip for increasing your salary. But I would definitely encourage proactivity in that area. And then quite an interesting one for me, it may apply to you, I have no idea, but again, I'm just trying to share my personal side of things here, was kind of trying to change my relationship with time in a way. And I suppose I've already spoken about trying to be more efficient with my time. And it sounds more complex than it is, but really it came down to a few things, and kind of mindfulness teaching me how important it is to be in the present moment. So we talk a lot within mindfulness about the idea of ruminating, so kind of overthinking things, and I was definitely an overthinker, and that's part of what led me to kind of spiral off. And I think a lot of people in architecture are probably overthinkers, because part of the way we're educated is to get plant a little seed of a concept and then just let it just gestate and grow and grow and grow until we kind of come up with this big concept, this big idea that turns into a building. And that's all kind of rumination and overthinking. So in and of itself, it's not bad, but when it becomes constantly either kind of dwelling on the past or fretting and worrying and being nervous about the future, that's when it can become a problem, and that's when it can start to turn into anxious thinking. So I would really say they're good lessons to take forward. Try not to dwell too hard on things that have happened in the past, which I know is easier said than done. But also try not to be overly worried about the future. And we can achieve all of that by being more grounded, spending more time in the present moment, engaging with our senses, and kind of all of those things that you'll probably have heard people talking about when it comes to mindfulness, and maybe thought, well, they're talking complete bollocks. But hopefully some of those things kind of resonate with some of you. But I still think it's important that we do think about the future, but not in a worrying way. We need to think about the future in a kind of planning sense, and what are my goals, what are my targets, and how can I achieve those? And actually, I've been quite strategic in my career, making things like 5-year plans, and I find they actually help to make me calmer. They help to make me more relaxed, because I kind of know what I need to try and do and by when, and then I can work out a strategy to get there. And finally, a big thing that I struggled with at first, but is really important to me now, is actually gratitude. And I think it's in 2020, the year of COVID, this idea of gratitude and being grateful for what we have is more important than ever, because we can all look at our situation, I think, and say, I've had a shit year, things have gone wrong for me, I've not been able to do X, Y, or Z. And for me, this year was my wedding. I was supposed to have got married last month, and we've had to move the wedding, and it's not been the best year at all. But it's about what's got me through has been looking at the positive stuff in my life, looking at the fact that I have good friends, good family, good job, all of these things, and whatever it might be for you, whatever's special to you and makes you kind of feel lucky to be here and lucky to be experiencing life. So on that note, I kind of wanted to run a quick exercise with you guys. So I don't know if you've got a pen and paper to hand, or you could just open a notes app on your phone or something. But I just wanted to ask you to think about some things that make you happy. So firstly, 3 people who make you happy. 3 people in your life. They don't have to be people that you see every day. They don't have to be even people that you've seen recently, but 3 people that talking to, spending time with makes you feel good. And when you've done that, I would just like you to think about 3 activities that you do, or 3 hobbies that you have, which make you feel good. And they don't, it doesn't have to be anything elaborate. It could just be anything simple as having a bath, or watching Netflix, or reading a book, or something like that. But 3 activities that make you happy. And then finally, I just wanted to get you to try and jot down, and this might be a bit of a tricky one, this might be the hardest one yet, but hopefully you can come up with some 3 things about work that make you happy, 3 things about your job that you enjoy and that make you feel positive, make you feel good. So now I just wanted to kind of ask you to think a little bit more deeply on that, and having a look at that list, just ask yourself, do you do enough of these things, or do you see enough of these people, or do you speak to those people enough? And I'm going to make an educated guess and say that if you're anything like me, you probably don't do a lot of those things as much as you'd like to. And perhaps that's an opportunity, rather than seeing it as a negative thing, seeing it as an opportunity, a way that something you can work on. Can you get more of that stuff in your life? Can you speak to those people more? Can you do more of those things at work? Can you kind of try to change things at work, or in the way you work, to do more of those things? And can you adjust your work-life balance, or the way that you spend your free time, so that you get to do more of those activities that make you happy as well? And I completely understand it's not easy at all, particularly now, and we're all kind of struggling with our routines, but if you can try and get more of those things into your life, I think it's a good start. So I'm going to touch quite briefly on the Architects Mental Wellbeing Forum for those of you who aren't aware of it, but I would really urge you to go and check out our website, which is just amwf.co.uk. So this was a group that I co-founded in 2017 with some help from my boss, John Assail. And that was really off the back of reading some of those stats in the AJ. And obviously, with my experience, what I've been through, something I wanted to try and improve in the industry. So basically, we got together a group of about, I think 12 or 13 practices, plus some reps from the RIBA and from the Architects Benevolent Society, with the aim of improving mental health across the industry, getting people talking about it more, strengthening this kind of dialogue, and removing the taboos around mental health. And we've been really lucky actually since we started. So we published, we sent out a newsletter initially, kind of put that around online, telling people what we wanted to achieve. Got a lot of responses from that, and then our numbers have kind of gradually grown. We published a mental wellbeing toolkit in 2019, which you can access from the resources page of our website. And the idea behind that was to try to support both employers and architects in kind of ways that they could improve mental health within their practices and within their daily lives. And since that, we've had lots of supporting practices, actually, lots of practices get in touch with us, kind of new ones every week, saying they would like to kind of commit to those values and to improving mental health in the industry. So it's been going really well. Actually, the Associated Consulting Body of Architects Australia, something along those lines. Basically, the Australian RIBA have recently been in touch, and they've just set up their own mental wellbeing forum off the back of that, because they've got a lot of similar issues over there as well. So we also published a COVID toolkit earlier this year, which again I'd recommend you have a look at, and that's responding more directly to the kind of mental health issues coming out because of COVID. So yeah, if anyone would like to know more, get involved, do go to the website. Please, if you think your practice would be interested in becoming a supporting practice, then please do that. And one of our goals for this year, unfortunately, we've kind of had to put the brakes on a little bit with things this year because people being furloughed and obviously lots of other things that people have been working on and trying to get through this year. But we are going to try and set up a big event where we get all of the founding practices and the supporting practices involved in one big event, and potentially even open that up to the public too. So do keep your eyes out on that. And yeah, I wanted to touch next on Happy by Design, my book. And I've called it How to Write a Book by Accident because that's kind of what happened, really. I started kind of putting together, I was just interested in reading about the relationship between buildings and mental health. So I started reading about it and finding lots of like cool facts and interesting bits of data and research. And I just started saving these into a folder. And I thought, well, maybe I could put together a kind of design guide for a sale. It could start to impact the way that we design buildings, and it just kind of grew and grew and grew. And then before I knew it, I kind of had about 150 pages of stuff. And one of my colleagues said, "Oh, I think that could have legs as a book." So I approached a few publishers, and Reba Publishing said they'd be interested, and we kind of turned it into a book together. But really, yeah, it looks at kind of all of the ways in which the environment around us impacts us. And there's obviously many ways, and I don't really need to preach to you guys because I'm sure you'll all be aware of it. And certainly with the year that we've had, anyone who wasn't convinced that our homes or the built environment affected us psychologically, I think has pretty much come on board with it now. But it looks through, everything from kind of daylight and artificial light, the kind of comfort that we feel in spaces, whether that's comfortable furniture or thermally comfortable, acoustically comfortable, right through to things like kind of more psychological aspects, so sense of pride in where we live, even the way that like kind of high ceiling give us a sense of psychological freedom. So it just brings together a lot of lessons from environmental psychology and neuroscience, really, and tries to convey those to architects, to developers. And yeah, I don't necessarily want to go into too much depth about the book, but I just wanted to include it more as a way to reflect upon the journey that mental health, the journey that mental health has kind of taken me on. And if you told me when I was in that really bad place in my mid-20s that I would end up writing a book and my career would go off in this really quite strange trajectory that I'd never planned for it, I think I would have probably just laughed at you. I wouldn't have thought it was possible. But weirdly, because I did have that kind of crisis, it's ended up with this. And a big part of it was actually realizing that a lot of these things could be an advantage, and that in and of themselves, stress and anxiety actually aren't bad things, which might sound like a controversial thing to say, but actually at low levels, stress and anxiety, the reason we feel anxious is it's a safety mechanism. It's our brain basically using the evolutionary mechanisms that helped us to survive. And had our early Homo sapien ancestors not had those kind of parts of their brain that made them feel anxious about things, they wouldn't have panicked when they saw the saber-toothed tiger or whatever it might have been. And we wouldn't have evolved to be here today. So the fact that you are here today is the reason you have that kind of system that's wired for worry, stress, and anxiety. But if we can harness these things rather than have them control us, then they can be really useful. They can help us to hit deadlines. They can be really good motivators. I'm stressed because I've got this deadline that I haven't hit yet, or I don't feel like I'm near hitting. If you didn't get that stress, you probably would have a lot less motivation to get the work done. So as long as they don't, as I say, overwhelm us, they can be really beneficial. Similarly, for anyone that's had experiences with depression, I know just how horrific it can be, completely overwhelming. And that thing that people don't really ever tell you about depression, it's not just about feeling sad, it's about almost having no energy to do anything, feeling like you literally just are empty, you have no energy to even get off the sofa. And it's a horrible thing to go through. But what I found is that having been through some of that myself, albeit not severe depression, but certainly depression at some level, is it helps you to become a more empathetic person. It helps you to, I think, to be kinder to people, to be gentler with people, and to kind of understand that you can see someone from the outside and think one thing and have absolutely no idea what they're feeling inside and no idea what they're going through. So again, we can look at that kind of horrible experience of depression, and once we come out the other side of it, really, actually, it can benefit us as a person, although it obviously doesn't feel like it at the time. And I think that empathy as well, it's so valuable actually in your career too. I think it makes you a better leader, a better people manager, and so can actually be a really valuable tool. So I'm going to wrap up pretty soon because I've already waffled on for about 40 minutes and you probably want to get off and have your dinner. But I just wanted to give a quick plug for the Architects Benevolent Society before I do go. I'm an ambassador for the society. They are doing amazing stuff at the moment, particularly obviously with COVID. So they do a whole range of things. So financial support for people who've been made redundant, or people who've maybe suffered injuries, all kinds of things like that. Even through to like people who are really sick, diagnosed with things like cancer. They are there to help architects. And they're also there to help architects when it comes to mental health. So you can, if you're struggling with your mental health, you can get in touch with the Architects Benevolent Society. There's a phone number on their website, and they can basically put you in touch with Anxiety UK, who can then refer you they'll kind of have a quick chat with you. And if you really are suffering, they will refer you for help with a kind of qualified therapist. So that could be a more kind of conversational therapist, like traditional therapy. It could be CBT, something like that. There's a whole range of ways they can help. So I really would hate the idea that anybody out there is suffering in silence. I know that a lot of people get kind of imposter syndrome as well a bit with mental health, in the sense of kind of thinking, well, I feel down, I feel low, or I feel anxious, but am I really that bad? Do I really need help? But I would really encourage you to try and get help before it becomes a problem, because if you let it get to the point I got to, it's so much harder to come back from there. And so if you can, I would, if you're on the fence about it, better safe than sorry, I would give them a call and get in touch. So that is everything from me. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate you joining and listening to me waffle on, as I said. My contact details are here, and I'm more than happy to talk to anybody if you've got any questions. If you want me to put you in touch with any of the people or the things that I mentioned, or if you want to know more about the forum, I'm more than happy to chat. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben, very much for that. And really, I'd like to congratulate you on your research and wealth of information. We'll share the resources mentioned by you tonight and also the presentation. There's a few questions coming in, so very interesting ones. So do environments affect women's mental health differently to men?
Sorry, what was the question there?
Do environments affect women's mental health differently to men?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually. There's a cultural element to everything first. So biologically, yes, is the first answer. So a good example I can give is a test where the researchers put people in a range of different spaces, from tidy spaces through to messy spaces, and they tested their cortisol levels, which cortisol is a stress hormone, so they can test the saliva and tell basically how much cortisol is in someone's body. And they found that actually women reacted more strongly to the messy spaces than to than the men did. Women found they made them quite a lot more stressed, men sort of a little bit more stressed. So to me, that's really interesting. I'd love to know the kind of anthropological evolutionary reasons for that, but certainly I think there are biological differences between men and women. We can't get away from that. And I think it's important that we understand those and we don't try and sort of pretend we're all completely the same, because we aren't all completely the same. And we do, certain things are different about us, and we should celebrate those differences, absolutely. But then, yeah, there's the cultural side of things as well, as I said. So when we're designing with things like colour, we need to be really careful, because people from different parts of the world can, see colour in a very different way. So In countries like China, you could use red as a colour it's a symbol for celebration. It's a very positive colour. But in parts of Africa, red can be a colour that's associated with kind of death and mourning. So again, we just need to really be kind of the more diverse we can have design teams, the better, because people are going to have better understanding of all of these different issues. And we just need to think about everybody when we design things.
Brilliant. Another question. So after going through what you have said and now being able to reflect on it, how would you recommend that new students approach studying architecture at university?
It's a really difficult question, isn't it? Because if I was to go back and do it again, I would absolutely, I think I would be able to detach myself from it in a way and not get caught up in that culture. But it's so tough because it gets fed down from year to year, and this idea of doing all-nighters in the studio, it's so hard to resist. But for me, I think it finally sort of clicked for me, or I thought it did in 5th year anyway. I clearly didn't, because I then took a load of the unhealthy habits into the workplace, but I was certainly more disciplined in 5th year. I think I was kind of getting into the studio at about 9:30 every day, probably working till about 8 p.m, which is like, I think, fairly reasonable compared to what a lot of people were doing. May have been a little bit less than that. But for me, it was more about planning, and I think I would put more of an emphasis on planning. The people that I saw that were kind of most successful, and definitely now professionally, the people that are most successful are the people who, rather than just jumping straight in, sit down at the start of the day and just spend 10 minutes writing out everything they need to do, what they've got to do to get to kind of achieve those goals, as I said earlier, be it becoming more kind of output and task oriented. And it might seem like, oh, I don't have that. That's the myth you get wrapped up in, is I don't have the time to do that. I'm too busy to do that. But actually, sometimes stopping and stepping away from the rush and just strategizing is the most efficient thing you can do, and it will save you lots of time in the long run.
All right, so we've got actually loads of questions coming in. Thank you, Ben. So another one is, what tips do you have for someone who's acknowledged things they have to change in terms of working hours and work-life balance, but struggling to make the first steps for fear of looking like they're slacking? So how should one approach this with the office, with their leadership team? Do you have any recommendations on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I completely understand. It's all right for me to sit here, and people probably think I'm sitting up here on a high horse. But I went through that process myself, where I came to the. Can you still hear me? Sorry, I think my internet connection's gone a bit dodgy.
Yes, can hear you.
Can hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, I went through that experience myself, where I kind of had to have quite a difficult conversation, because I just realised that this isn't sustainable for me to do these long hours anymore, and I kind of was asked by someone who was senior to me, sort of, we've noticed you started going home a bit earlier, and I said, well, I have, but I'm getting all my work done, I'm achieving my goals, my clients are happy, my team leader is happy, so actually it shouldn't really be a problem. And I think actually that conversation was the start of a bit of a mindset shift for certain people here, and we're really lucky here now at SAIL. We have an amazing kind of workplace philosophy. We don't get lots of people working late nights, and you know, if projects do have loads of extra hours required on them, then we get overtime for that even. So there is a real appreciation for people's time. But yeah, I do understand how difficult that can be. In a lot of offices, there's a kind of philosophy of like, you don't leave before the boss. But it's difficult, particularly when we're in a situation now where employers have a lot more of the power, because jobs and work are in short supply. So it may just be a case for the next few months we all kind of have to knuckle down and try and get through, which I know is not nice to hear, particularly when mood is probably quite low around the country with everything that's going on. But certainly when things become a little bit more normal, I think that's probably then, you know, pick the moment to challenge it. But if you're getting your work done to a really high standard and everyone's really impressed with what you do, I think you need to back yourself and say, I've done my work is really good, and I've hit all my deadlines. And yeah, I think in this country we need to try and flip it around. You know, if you go and work in, say, Denmark, if you're there working late, they don't think you're a hard worker. They think you're a bit of a dullard, a bit of a sort of slow-witted idiot who can't get their work done on time. And unfortunately, that's just a mentality shift that we still haven't got to that point yet in this country. We're lagging behind a bit. But I'm quite hopeful as well that one of the positives of COVID may be that because of remote working and this increased flexibility, things do become more about output and about, you know, is X, Y, or Z person hitting their targets, not are they spending 10 hours a day at their desk.
And then what are your top tips for employers in setting up a mindful workplace?
For employers?
Yes.
Oh, that's an interesting one. A mindful workplace. Well, I mean, from the very start, I think it's about trying to get people on board with that philosophy. And so one of the things we've done here is we've run kind of mindfulness sessions. And initially I came in pretty strong, as is my kind of, it's my character, it's my tendency to do that. And said, right, everyone, yeah, let's do mindfulness classes. And I said, let's do them at 8:30 in the morning before the office opens. And obviously I didn't get that many respondents because everyone just hits the snooze button. So we almost kind of brought it in like mindfulness by stealth. So doing things like mindful drawing classes have been really successful, where we get out things like finger paints or stuff like that almost, and it's like trying to setting a project or a challenge for to create something working in a strange way that might be working with your fingers, working with cotton buds, or something that just you really have to pay attention to the process, and that's been very successful. We've got people in as well to speak, people who know much more about the subject than I do, to speak about mental health, to speak about mindfulness. I think those things are all really important. But like I said, going back to those things about making staff aware that it's okay to take a break. And I've read some horrible things this morning, actually, in a Guardian piece that Ollie Wainwright has just published about practices they're asking staff to keep their camera on all day so they can watch them and check that they're being productive. And that's completely what we don't want. What we want to try and do is harness a culture of trust and a culture where staff feel like they are respected as adults and you trust them to get their work done. You're not spying on them and making sure they're getting it done. Unfortunately, based on that Guardian article, that still doesn't exist in a lot of practices. And to me, that's not advanced level stuff. That's like the basic starting point. So I think that's a good place to start from anyway.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Ben. Then there's also this idea of how can one get training, how can one become a mental health first aider. So someone saying here that they are, if you're part of a more traditional practice and they're not quite familiar with this issue, how can one get involved and get training?
So that's a bit more of a straightforward one. Mental Health First Aid UK, they've got a really good website, and you can go on there and you can find people that are doing courses in your local area. I'm assuming at the moment, I don't know this, but I would guess they're obviously doing all their training online, which in a way makes it easier because you don't have the travel and things associated. I simply went to John Assail and said, John, I've been recommended this course by a few people. I think it would be really beneficial. I kind of set out to him the benefits to the practice, the fact that staff would have someone to go and talk to. And I think if you're clever about it, you can also deliver it in such a way that actually you're taking a bit of the burden off them as the practice leader. So people won't necessarily always come to them with problems. They can come to talk to you about things a little bit more. And I think if you were to put it across in that way, it might work quite well as well, actually. But yeah, I would just try and give them the hard sell in terms of the benefits, because there are so many benefits to having a mental health first aider, and I think every single practice should have one.
Yeah, we fully agree with that, Ben. And also there's this discussion about, you started talking about how architecture as a profession is inherently insecure, uncertain. in the subject that shocks, and also in architecture education, nobody really discusses this aspect. What do you think people can do to convert this insecurity into a more positive notion of flexibility and opportunity, and prepare students to actively embrace uncertainty rather than fear it?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it is very hard to deal with uncertainty, and we as human beings, we're not good at dealing with it. We like routine and we like pattern, and actually I think within architecture, compared to a lot of industries, people quite often find a place they like and they stay there for a long time, and I'm probably a case in point. I've been here at Sale for 8.5 years now. But I think that kind of mentality can sometimes get a bit dangerous if you become wedded to this idea that I'm going to be at this place for the rest of my career. I think flexibility and kind of being agile of mind is really valuable, really important. And I think it's certainly something that you can try and work on, whether that's through kind of meditation or CBT as well is very good for that. Kind of CBT was very helpful for me, and it's worth saying you can do CBT sort of training or courses online for free. Often you can just find kind of like worksheets that you fill out, and they can be really revealing about you and the way you think about stuff. For me, a big thing that I was struggling with was this idea of catastrophizing, and I don't know if any of you guys have heard that term. Maybe you can relate to it, but it's this idea that when something goes wrong, even sort of slightly, you instantly extrapolate it to the worst possible outcome. So for me, it would be something like I'd iron a shirt in the morning. I would have turned the iron off, but I would be halfway to work. I would have forgotten whether or not I turned the iron off, and then I'd have a complete meltdown thinking I'm going to burn my own house down, which is completely irrational, really. But my brain was in such a negative place that it was going to the very worst possible outcome. And one thing that I got taught by this CBT therapist that I had was the idea that kind of every single daily event, everything that happens to you, millions of things happen to us every day, right, or every week, every year, and those things are all on a bell curve, and sort of bell curve like this, and the majority of those things, 80% or whatever of those things sit within the kind of middle chunk where we don't need to worry about them. They're kind of either fairly good, a bit bad, or kind of okay. It's only really very, very rarely in life do we have these things happen to us that are either really amazing or really, really shit and that ruin our lives. They're, very, very rare. And she said to me, you wouldn't go into work and kind of be thinking, well, I've definitely won the lottery. So why would you go into work and think I've definitely burned my house down? It's trying to balance those ideas and really just be a bit more rational about your worries. And I think that's quite a good mindset to take into dealing with uncertainty. So try not to get completely transfixed about the worst possible outcome, and actually try and balance it out and say, well, what's the best possible outcome from this situation? Okay, so an example is I've been made redundant, and that's obviously terrible. But a good thing that could happen out of that is actually you could end up using it as a way to look at your life and reassess, okay, well, what didn't I like about my life before? What didn't I like about my job before? What can I improve in my next job? What can I look for in my new job that can actually take me in a direction I'm really passionate about? And 2 years down the line, you could be doing a job that you're way happier in, but you just settled into the routine of the previous job. So I think it's all about trying to balance out those negative thoughts with positive thoughts. And unfortunately, as humans, we are kind of programmed to focus on negative thoughts. As I mentioned, that kind of evolutionary survival mechanism. We needed to focus on the negatives in the past because they were the things that kept us alive. But it's not really the case anymore. But our brains just haven't really caught up.
Thank you, Ben. Just to make it clear to everyone, so CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy.
That's right.
That's it. So if you want to look into that, it's a very useful tool. There's another question. I'll just combine a few of them on the same topic. So there's something around, is the attention to detail your friend or enemy in architecture? And I think this ties in with your talk about being a perfectionist. And I think this is probably a good time to tell us how you actually wrote this book. On top of all your project work, being a prolific architect, research speaker, is probably around something to do with setting yourself deadlines and.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because we obviously work in an industry where safety is a huge issue, and we've only got to look at Grenfell to kind of be aware of that and all of the fallout of that at the moment. And absolutely, like, perfectionism is an important skill, but it's one that we need to control the perfectionism and use it to our advantage rather than letting the perfectionism control us. So absolutely agree, when you're doing a fire detail, you've got to be perfect. When you're doing a waterproofing detail, you've got to be perfect. But when you're looking at the junction between a bit of brick and a bit of timber and a bit of aluminium, and you've designed 16 different details to try and make it look perfect and get the perfect shadow gap, maybe that's the moment when you need to step back and have a look at your perfectionism and go, this isn't really helping me. This is actually hindering me now, and I've been in the office till 11 o'clock at night thinking about this shadow gap. You know, how's this going to impact my performance tomorrow? And so, yeah, I think it's a good point that perfectionism, it's a necessary evil, and it definitely has its place where it can be really helpful. Sorry, what was the second part of the question? I've waffled on way too long there and distracted myself.
No, that's brilliant. Just wanted to ask how you managed to find the time to actually write the book.
So for me, actually, it was about making the most of my phone, and we forget, like, we've got more technology in our phones now than they had when they got to the moon on, what was it, Apollo 11. They're amazing things, and again, they're things that can be pretty negative for our mental health, but they're things that can be really powerful too. And for me, I kind of started setting out the different chapters and the different sections of the book, and it was very much like I kind of wrote it in almost in, I suppose it's similar to the way you design a building. You kind of build it up from basic ideas and then flesh those out and then flesh those out a bit more. So every chapter just started out as bullet points, and then within like a notes app or within Google Docs or something, and then I would add, you know, break down each bullet point into a series of bullet points, and then they become your paragraphs, and then you break down those bullet points into further bullet points, and they become your sentence. Before you know it, kind of you can start to write chapters of a book sitting on a bus or, you know, on a long train journey just on your phone. And for me, that was that was really useful, because being the kind of person that I am, and you kind of mentioned obviously how busy we all are as architects, I don't think I could have sort of strapped myself in to a chair and just sat there at the computer for, you know, 10 hours every weekend writing stuff. I wouldn't have been able to do that. So yeah, I think making use of technology in kind of a clever way is definitely a way that we can make ourselves more efficient.
Brilliant. And we'll just take one more. I'm aware it's past.
Oh,
don't
worry.
So what are your tips for recently qualified architects who are new to managing project teams? There's a comment around sometimes there is some pressure to prove yourself and build your career. It also has a knock-on effect with people you're working with. I guess probably this ties into your conversation around building healthy habits.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I would say all the one quality that all of the best people I've worked under have had is, it goes back to that idea of empathy and kindness. Obviously, it's really important that people are productive working for you, people hit deadlines and things like that. But, you know, I would hope that anyone you've got working for you understands the importance of deadlines. They don't need to be sort of pressured or spoken to negatively to help them achieve those deadlines. And actually, all the most successful teams that I've ever seen have got a team leader they've gained respect from people in their team because they've treated them with compassion and kindness and empathy. And, you know, if someone says, I need to go home at 5 o'clock tonight to do X, Y, Z, then be kind and let them do that, because that will, I'm sure that half an hour that you lose of them at the end of the day will more than repay itself in their kind of loyalty and respect for you. And ultimately, as I said, when people are happier, their work is better. If they respect you and they like you, they'll go to the ends of the earth for you, and they will produce better quality work than if they become disgruntled or unhappy or kind of jaded with you or the project. So I think that kindness and empathy is the main thing I would try to encourage.
That's all we had for today. Thank you very much, Ben, for that. It was a very good talk, and thank you everyone for the questions as well. It was a very interesting session. If you've got any more, then email us across, and we'll put a list together, and we'll send you the answers.
Great, thank you very much.